Right, so this is lecture number 15. This is about John Locke. So during the Enlightenment, there were two types of uses of reason that each one wanted to construct an entire culture based on reason. So Descartes and Kant are the dualists. They're the ones that detach reason from your body and from your emotions, and you're supposed to act just on reason. So, the way that has evolved over time is that the young people who are good at math and whatever, calculating, they go into engineering there. That's a pure reason sort of discipline. And they've obviously become very successful, creating an internet and all sorts of stuff, but they obviously don't have values. They're using their engineering capacities, some of them for trying to keep on fossil fuels forever, some of them to try to go green, some of them somewhere in between, some of them to create social media. So they have the intellectual virtues, the dualist version of it, but not the moral virtues, or they're not necessarily connected. This is the other school of thought, the empiricists. So Francis Bacon was an empiricist. So when he talked about the kind of knowledge he wants middle axioms. Another thing he said that I forgot to mention was he compares his view to the Catholic Church, which had integrated Aristotle. And Bacon even says that's not a very good fit. He knew that wasn't really very faithful to Aristotle, but he's going to criticize the whole thing. So he compared it to the spiders, the bees, and the ants. So the ants just collect facts and never make any sense of them. It's this complete overload of information. Well, hello. We have that problem, right? We have way too much information without an ability to process it, reflect on it, interpret it, prioritize it. And so, because that takes a whole different capacity, there's a lot of fake news. There's misinformation, there's disinformation, there's data points that people then argue this follows from it, and it isn't a good inference. It's just too much data. So that's the ants. The spiders are the ones that take that's the Aristotle and the Catholic Church. They take every fact, like the eyeball, and they attach it to, oh, you have to understand why it's there, its function in the biosphere and the universe. And you attach every fact to this huge cosmic philosophy. And our purpose is simply to understand, not to change it, to fit ourselves into the universe and the biosphere and create a culture that fits in. All right, Bacon, is the bee, right? Takes the honey, takes the pollen from the flowers, those are the facts, and then processes them and then makes honey, right? Makes something different out of the pollen and something useful to human beings. All right, so the next four lectures are going to be empiricists. And John Locke is the first one. And he is both an empiricist and the founder, or the person we often refer to as the one who developed human rights ideology, ideas, a set of ideas based on human rights. Okay, so let me start out with John Locke's history, when he lived, what motivated him, his overall worldview. Where is it? Here we go. All right. So there was a man named Thomas Hobbes, and he, in this little speech I created, I talk about Thomas Hobbes. So John Locke and Hobbes lived at a time during the British Civil War. So life was extremely violent. The social fabric, what Aristotle would call, what the Greeks would call the social fabric, trust and goodwill for people, people using their power for the well-being of others. The social fabric had completely become unraveled. The Protestants and the Catholics, they were going at it. And it was also connected to class because your religion was connected to your wealth. Anyway, there was a really dissolution of society. Thomas Hobbes argued that people are by nature irrational and they will never use power for the benefit of the ruled. They will never be generous. They're incapable of it. They will always use whatever intellectual ability they have to get more power, more money. And life by nature is brutal and short and horrible. And so Hobbes argues for the need for one very powerful dictator who runs everything. Whatever he says is right because he said it. It's the only way to keep people in order. It's the only way to prevent chaos. All right. Then William and Mary, okay, there was a lot of insecurity, as I said. John Locke was an intellectual. He was an empiricist. He studied the great thinkers. He knew about Copernicus, Galileo, Bacon. He agreed that Newtonian physics was right. Scientific method was the direction of the future. He's all on board. He took a position a step further by writing books about the human mind and how we learn the nature of knowledge. So he rejected Aristotle's psychology. He rejected the Catholic Church because the Catholic Church misinterpreted Aristotle. It was a misinterpretation, but it dominated the culture. Innate ideas like God implants. Well, that was Descartes. God implants these ideas. He rejects that. He also rejects Kant's view of these a priori reason that we're born into the world with these rational categories. He's not not a modern rationalist. He's not Aristotelian. He's not Catholic Church. He's rejecting all of that. And he says he's going to take sense data. We look with our five senses. Then we develop ideas, hypotheses from our experience and test whether they're true by testing our hypothesis. And this, I think, is what you learn in a lot of science classes, and also social science works in that same methodology. You're gathering facts, and then you want to figure out, is there a pattern here? Is there some knowledge I can gain? And so you create this hypothesis about here's what looks like a pattern, something we can know about data, and then you test it. I believed in God, but I didn't think there was any scientific evidence for it, okay? God is an object of faith. John Locke, also believed in the Trinity. And I used scientific method to argue for it in the sense that I took every quote from the Bible that indicated that Jesus was the Messiah, right? There were some Old Testament prophets predicting the coming of a Messiah. There was the Mount of Olives. There was a transfiguration. There was when John baptized Jesus and a voice from above came. And so he gathered all the data and he says, based on this, I believe, right? But it's an object of faith. It's not reason. Plus, I thought I also accepted the kind of God that Kant and Descartes thought of. I just didn't get there in the same way. I didn't use that kind of reason. I would read the Bible, it looked like Jesus was the Messiah, so there's God, right? So I inferred it from everything that happened in the Bible, but I didn't, God was not inconsistent with science. Science is really important. And we're supposed to use our reasoning capacities, our ability to gather facts, gain knowledge, and use it for human well-being. That's what God wants us to do. I also believe no atheist should be in civil society because they can't be trusted to tell the truth or to be honest. Okay, I think people need religion to behave, but I do not think political systems should impose any particular religious belief. And I don't think politicians should claim that they're speaking for God ever. That was England, divine right of kings. And that led to so many wars. Forget it. Done. I won. I actually, when the US colonies over in the America, when some of the British immigrants decided to declare independence and to establish their own country, I was their advisor, counselor, because I wanted a country that was based on the separation of church and state so that no leaders could refer to God, and also that was based on facts. So you're holding your leader accountable for their behavior based on facts, experiences, something specific. You don't trust their judgment. You don't, nothing. Just tell me, am I better off economically or not? If I'm not going to vote for you. So that was my attitude. And I was very motivated to help the Americans write a constitution, a Declaration of Independence, a political ideology that would really fit with the future, with progress, with science and technology. Okay, so when I was 53, so this is after Hobbes died, um, King James was crowned and there was this somewhat of a power struggle going on. And what happened was the British did not want another civil war, okay? Because well, it turned out that the person who was going to inherit the kingdom was Catholic, and that would start a whole nother war. So, um, so the leaders in England um, brought over William and Mary. Okay, William and Mary were okay. It just has to do with the inheritance, right? They said if you agree not to dictate, not to be any kind of absolute monarch, if you agree to give over all the power to the parliament, we will have a revolution. We'll bring you over here and we'll block the ability of the Catholics to rule again. Okay. So, so it was called the Bloodless Revolution of 1688. And I lived at that time, right? Unlike Hobbes. And so a constitutional government, I read about it in Aristotle, it's common sense, is one where the parliament that are elected make the rules. And so basically they take turns ruling and being ruled. And so the king and queen are just figureheads. They don't have the power. Now in England, they still are. And the British still sort of, everybody thinks they're cool, you know, that there've been some weddings and there's half the world is watching their weddings on TV, which I think is kind of crazy. But anyway, they don't have power. They're just figureheads. And so the parliament takes over. Well, I wanted to help the Americans write a constitution where right up front, it's a constitutional government. There's no king, there's a president, but there's a balance of powers, and there's a lot of mixing of leaders that are elected and leaders that are appointed. It's a polity, which is what Aristotle said is the best form of government. Okay, so Parliament wrote a Bill of Rights. So we developed this language of natural rights, not the divine right of kings, but natural rights. So this was emerging and I was all on board. And the French Revolution also was based on natural rights. So it was happening in more than just one place. It was a very exciting time to live. Science, technology, industry, human rights. So we're going to change the culture because the economic system is changing. We need a cultural system that will really reinforce this new kind of economy. Okay, so there were many people involved, and in my second treatise of government, I tried to articulate how people should think, okay? It's the philosophy, the ideology, about themselves, the nature of human relationships, the family, economic relationships, political relationships. I wanted them to develop a notion of the individual and society, which would enable them to define the nature of political authority and what is and is not legitimate use of political power. So Aristotle just said justice is ruled for the benefit of the ruled. Well, of course, but how do you know if the leader is ruling for the benefit of the ruled? You have to have proof. And so I wanted a system where it would be based on proof, empirical data. Okay, so here's how I wrote it. To understand political power correctly, we have to consider the state that people are naturally in, right? What are people by nature, right? So I posited people are by nature free and equal. Now, for somebody who's basing things on facts, where did you get that? You know, society does not structure people as free and equal. Society has a class structure, an entrenched class structure. People aren't free to change their class status or anything. So why would I say something like that? The state of equality, all the power is mutual. That's not a fact. That's never been true. Now, when I said these things, I knew it was an abstraction, right? But I wanted to train people to think in a certain way because this was going to be the best way to preserve a check on the use of political power and to encourage people to control their behavior in ways that are conducive to social order and conducive to flourishing in this new economy because industry was leading, people were giving opportunities to create new products and to be very creative because all of a sudden we have all sorts of knowledge. So give people a lot of independence to be creative. Now, the next step is that even though we're born free and equal, it's not a state of license. Doesn't mean you can do anything you want. It has a law of nature to govern it, and that's reason. All right. So we're back to the word reason, just that you have to be very careful because this use of reason is not at all Descartes and Kant. And he knows that. It's totally different. It teaches all humankind not to harm, that we are free and equal in our life, our liberty, our health, and our possessions, okay? And reason teaches us that no one should harm anybody else's life, liberty, don't hinder their freedom, health, or possessions. Don't take anything from it, okay? All right, so I created this new view of reason, or Aristotle has that view. It's one of the intellectual virtues. It's calculation, how to calculate how to achieve the goal you set for yourself is calculation. So he's taking that and he's trying to build a whole society based on it. Okay, so I disagreed with, I agreed with Copernicus, Kepler, Newton, and Galileo on how to gain new knowledge. But in writing about culture, how people relate to each other in society, I disagreed with Pascal. I disagreed with Hobbes completely. I did not think that when left to their own devices, people will destroy each other, right? The problem was, if you have this one person with absolute power and everybody is by nature power hungry, who's going to put a check on the power of that person? How is that person not going to really, really make everybody else suffer on your own view of human nature, right? So no, not at all. Instead, I assumed that people, by nature, I was more optimistic. I believed in human nature. People are good, or they will be good. They'll behave if you give them the freedom to use their reason to calculate their own self-interest. They won't harm each other. It's not in their self-interest to harm each other. It's in their interest to want to prosper. All right. So I was leery about the concentration of power, the concentration of wealth. We needed something entirely different. All right, so everyone is free and equal. I was also comparing that to Newton's view of the universe in the sense that a bunch of little atoms bouncing around, right? And they bounce around according to certain laws. They move according to the law of gravity. A body in motion will stay in motion unless friction is added to it. So I wanted this little image of human beings as these little creatures that bounce around and they're naturally free and they will flourish and they will calculate the means to their own well-being. But there's always friction, right? So well, how does this friction come in? All right, so everyone is bound to preserve themselves, right? So a rational person will want to preserve himself. And in order to preserve himself, he ought to also preserve everybody else, okay? So people naturally have goodwill for each other, or they should. It's rational. So I also had in this view a view of God. I believed in God, but and we're creatures of God, And we have the master, the ultimate master is God, and he's ordered the universe, and he has a plan for us because he gave us reason, and we're supposed to respect each other and prosper. Um, so what happens though, right? Sometimes one person will violate another person's rights, right? People kill each other. People oppress each other, take away their freedom. People hurt each other. So health didn't mean our healthcare system at all. It didn't mean giving people diabetes because of what they ate. There was no problems like that. It meant, you don't hurt another person. You don't cut their arm off. You don't poison them. You don't just undermine their health, right? And possessions. So sometimes people violate other people's natural rights. Well, what happens when that happens? So Locke is appealing to your reason. Okay, when that happens, the person wants to fight back, and they have a right. They have a natural right to fight back. The problem is people tend to overestimate how much harm the person did. So they tend to overreact and take revenge. And then the original person will think they've been violated and they'll overreact. And so Locke says that the state of nature for this particular reason will quickly degenerate into a state of chaos. And then nobody's property is protected. So if you're really interested in protecting your own life, liberty, health, and possessions, it's in your interest as a rational creature to give over that right to fight back. It's the only right that you give over. You still have all the other ones. Okay. In a state of nature, that's how when people overreact, then there's a power differential, and then there's oppression and the loss of freedom. So in order to maximize your own happiness or your rights, protect your own rights, you give over the right to fight back to a standing body of laws. The laws are made by officials that are elected by the people, and the officials must make laws that protect individual rights. Okay. Um, okay. Then that's the origin of political power. What about property, the natural right to property? So God gave the world to human beings in common. Everybody gets the world, and God gave us reason to make use of it, the best advantage of life and convenience. So we are supposed to use our reason to exploit natural resources to make life better for human beings. That goes right back to Bacon. The purpose of scientific knowledge is to apply it and improve the material conditions of human life. The most basic right to property is the right to your body. Nobody has a right to their body but themselves. And then the work of your body, the labor of your body. So you take those natural resources, make them into products. Whatever a person removes out of the state of nature that nature has provided, he's mixed with his labor and makes it his property. So if there's some land that no one is cultivating, someone decides to come and cut down the trees and plant corn so they can eat and they can sell some of it to build a house and become prosperous. That's what God wants us to do. God gave us the reason to do that. Okay. So he gave it to people in common, but he intended for us to be industrious and rational. This is the Protestant work ethic, okay? Because Locke was Protestant, and it is a rejection of the Catholic point of view. And so it's based on basically a Protestant worldview. And this work hard and become prosperous. Um, so if you're industrious and rational, but you shouldn't be quarrelsome and contentious. Um, the greed, God did not give the land to gratify the whims, impulses, or the greed of irrational people. Okay. So God intended that you cultivate the earth enough so you can have a barter system, so everybody shares from what they've worked for. But he didn't want money because money would enable somebody to get a lot more power than somebody else. Locke also thought, a lot of Europeans, that it was the Garden of Eden, that God ordained that Christopher Columbus go the other direction to get to India, and he found America because God wanted Europeans, especially Brits. Columbus was Spanish, but hey, 1, 2, skip a few, you know? God gave us that land so that we would use our tools, use science and industry, and work up that land and give everyone an opportunity so people can come from Europe and they're not stuck in the class system. You have opportunity. You're free and equal. You can get a homestead, can get some land, cut down the trees, plant crops, and trade with other people in town, right? So this was heaven on earth. This was the Garden of Eden. He also argued that the Native Americans had no right to the land because they didn't make it they didn't give it value. They didn't chop down the trees. They didn't exploit nature for human well-being. They had no real civilization, according to the Brits, Europeans. They lived at a subsistence level, right? Indigenous knowledge, how to live, integrate nature and culture, and just live a simple life, keep the resources how they are, allow for the cycle of nature. But they didn't respect that, right? The natives are just a kind of sophisticated animal. They're not developed. And that's not what God wants, right? So God is on our side. They didn't understand the Judeo-Christian God. So there was a whole system of re-educating the Native American children. Of course, that caused a lot of trauma. Trying to convert them to the religion so they understand God's plan, so we can kick them off the land and they won't fight, right? But if they do resist, we have a right given by God, protected by our government, to kill them off. So the national militia would come if people were trying to homestead and the Native Americans were coming after them. Okay, so the Europeans were superior in their intelligence, their reasoning, and in their culture. But Locke says, I did not accept the changes from a barter system to a money system because you need to keep it so people cannot accumulate wealth. Then people will work hard, but they won't become greedy. They won't be able to get greedy. What happened was, if you have a money system, people can accumulate wealth and then accumulate more and more. And there's no middle class anymore. People get exploited. And I didn't want that. Locke did not want that, right? It was after I died that we ended up with industrial capitalism, global capitalism, everything. But what annoys me, John Locke, is my ideas still get used to justify this huge concentration of wealth. That is not me. Don't use me to justify it. I wanted a barter system, um, and I wanted a middle class. I didn't want anybody to have more than they need. I understood Aristotle. Greed is the political evil. Anyway, all right. If everyone's free and equal, everyone has a right to punish. You give over that right. You give it over to a standing body of laws and to judges who apply the laws, and they are appointed by the leaders who are elected. Some judges are elected, some judges are appointed, but they have to always act in the interest of protecting the rights of the people. Let's see. Okay. So it's in every rational person's self-interest to give over that right to the laws. And this is how a community comes to be the umpire, by settled standing laws, impartial umpire, equal treatment under the law. And there are authorities from the community to execute the laws, but it's the community that decides, and it's for the sake of the community that they execute the laws. Okay. All right. Okay, when any number of human beings consents to make one community or government, they're incorporated, they make a body politic where the majority have a right to act and govern the rest. So majority rules, right? Whoever, the majority elects the officials, and the officials rule for the benefit of the ruled, but indirectly the majority are the ones that have the right. If they don't like the leaders, or if the leaders get corrupt, they have a right to elect somebody else. It's all for the sake of your own self-preservation, okay? It's a rational person seeking self-preservation will give over this right and consent to be a member of a community under a body of laws. All right, what's the purpose of government? So I'm going to hold off on that one and then focus for a minute on, that's his narrative. Oh yeah, here's my next one, which is my view of the human beings. So on the one hand, I thought that God exists and people need to believe in the immortality of the soul. I myself did, in my book, The Reasonableness of Christianity, I showed why it is, in what way I use reason to take that leap to faith and believe in immortality. But it was okay if Kant wants to do it another way, or Locke, or people can be deists of any different stripe as long as they believe in God, the soul, and immortality. But I also believed, from the point of view of science, in a blank slate. The psyche is born blank. Okay. And I thought, I even said in my essay concerning understanding, which is all about that we need to use our brain in a way, forget the Aristotelian view of mind, cut it out. It's not there. We don't want it. We don't want Kant. We don't want Descartes. We want facts, inference from facts. We want cognition. So that's like Descartes, cogito ergo sum. But Descartes also believed in innate ideas. So forget it. Let's just go with cognition. And this is if all your psyche does is cognize, and cognition depends upon experience. Well, then a fetus in the womb is like a vegetable. All right. It's not human. Um, all right. So if that's true, the only way, if the fetus is a blank slate, the way to save the world, the way to create this wonderful new world is in cultural conditioning, right? Appealing to reason, telling people free, equal rights to think that way and to get conditioned that way. And then the blank slate will be formed and you'll be able to have um, constitutional governments forever into the future and a strong middle class because people won't accumulate wealth. Okay, so I quote, a fetus in the mother's womb differs not much from the state of a vegetable. Okay, well, the issue there is how do you put together the immortality of the soul with the vegetable? All right. And so my my claim is that in the US we have incredible arguments about abortion, right? And they all are based on whether the fetus in the womb is a vegetable or not, and is yet fully human. Well, John Locke had that same conflict. We got handed that conflict is a part of our cultural legacy, is that huge conflict. So that's important. Okay. The other thing that was very important to Locke was religious toleration. So he wrote a book called An Essay Concerning Toleration. And it's really incredible if you want to read it, because he presents some of the arguments for intolerance and he answers those arguments. Now, even and I can concentrate on difficult books for a long time, but even I just about fall asleep trying to read this thing because we don't take those arguments seriously. You know, I have to imagine who he's arguing against, and the arguments seem so ridiculous to us. So there were many people who made many distinctions to come to the conclusion that therefore there should be one official state religion. And so he has to set every single objection, right? And so this is his argument. The true church, the true spirit of religion is toleration. Intolerance is a sign of a grab for power and empire. You use religion to justify grabbing power. That was definitely what happened in Europe. Let's call a spade and be tolerant, right? True religion is charity and goodwill. It's a way of life. Don't kill or torture anything in the name of religion. This is during a civil war, right after a civil war, right? That was based on religion, Protestant versus Catholic. Forget it. America is going to save us from religious war. Thank goodness. But we have to make sure to build this huge wall between the way people think when they're thinking as citizens and whatever other way they think in religion. You can have any kind of religious intolerance you want, as long as you don't bring it into your role as a citizen. But Locke says you shouldn't be intolerant. Those traditions that the people are allowed to come over here, that are intolerant. Calvinists, these people are anti-humanist, they're authoritarian within their religious community, whatever. But do not bring that into the civic space, right? Remember, political community is a certain kind of community. It's not a religious community. Everybody's equal and equally rational if they can figure out their self-interest. Keep religion out of it. But also, I don't think you should be intolerant. I disagree with that. True religion is just love God and love your neighbor as yourself, which is what Jesus said. That's the essence of the law and the prophets. The whole Old Testament can be summarized. Love God, love your neighbor as yourself. What more do you need? It's all right to reject the institutional church if you do it in order to love God and love your neighbor as yourself. That the institutional church is not doing that, so you quit. There's all these differences between doctrines and sects because people were coming over from Europe because they would be tolerated in America. And he's saying, yeah, but you should really get over your intolerance also. This is important for him to write a book like this because he wanted to make sure that they did not let that intolerance affect their role as a citizen. Civil government versus religion. People live in a commonwealth based on the rule of law. The purpose is to protect civil interests. Civil interests are life, liberty, health, possessions. The purpose of the commonwealth is to secure the just possession of goods and protect people from harm. The uses of the threat of external force to punishment to control people. That's what the civil government does. But the civil government's job is not to save people's soul or do God's will. All right? So if somebody's taken to court because they've murdered somebody, the court system is just, was there evidence? Is there enough evidence, it's a scientific method, to conclude beyond a reasonable doubt, you have reasonable right in there, because people are supposed to use their reason, that they're guilty or not guilty. Okay, and that's it. The judge should just, whatever. But the judge should not sit there as a judge and say, you're going to go to hell. You really ought to like pray like Jesus before, you got to straighten up your act and go to church and pray to Jesus so you don't go to hell. A judge should never say that, right? As a judge, like they can step down, they could go home, they can find out where this person goes to church, or they can, they can write a letter to this person as a citizen, but not as a judge. Okay. The consent of the people, even if people agree to intolerance, it's wrong. It's not the nature of a political community. Very important. Because it will degenerate. It's hard enough to set up a system where people agree and somebody does exercise power, but to keep that limited to just proving you violated your rights. Limited government, nothing more than that. And if you put religion in there, it's going to get way worse. A forced conversion is a corrupting influence on the one who forces and the one who's forced, right? A false confession. Because it's not the spirit of religion. It's not love God, love your neighbor as yourself to threaten people. Salvation is an inner force. It can't be controlled by external force. It can only be corrupted by it. The civil magistrate in his private life may try and persuade citizens to convert, but he can't use power as a civil magistrate to force people. No one can change another person's conscience by force, okay? Only by persuasion. Now, this is common sense to us, I hope, but at the time, wow, he is literally rewiring people's brains, getting them to think differently. In in relation to things that really matter to a lot of people, right? Fear of eternal punishment, reward. What is a church? What is a church? Very important. It's a completely different concept from Europe, because in Europe, you're a kid, you grow up, you're Catholic, you're Protestant, it's part of your identity. And it causes you to like certain people and hate other people. You don't think about it. It's part of your identity. And Locke is saying, no, no, your reason is your identity. And the church you go to, the doctrine, is a free and voluntary society. So in a free society, you can have social groups, all sorts of groups. The church is no different from any other social group. It's not by nature. Every church is based on choices, right? It wasn't ordained by God to have the Catholic Church. Each church has its own laws and its way of being ordered. If you're a member, you follow their rules. They're free to make or change their rules. Members are free to leave. The civil magistrate does not intervene, right? Freedom of association. He says, where Jesus says, right? Wherever two or three are gathered together. When Jesus said that, he was rejecting institutionalized religion, because the mega church guys, the rabbis who had the big churches, they were called the Sadducees, were corrupt. And the Pharisees, that were the fundamentalists, and kept using quotes from the Old Testament to oppress people. And of course, Locke saw that happening in Europe all the time. He grew up with it. And he knew that Jesus couldn't stand it. Those were the people he argued against. And so John Locke is saying, if you gather together, Jesus is there. You don't need to force anybody else. It's just your free association. Christians might suffer persecution, but they should never engage in it as Christians. The goal of the church is the salvation of souls, not money, not power. A church can excommunicate their members, but they can't take their property or hurt their body, right? They can't violate their life, liberty, health, or property. The church has no power to do this. There can be no discrimination in civil life because of religious association. Even in the case of pagans, you can't discriminate against people if they're pagans, okay? You have to hire them at the same salary if they're the best qualified, sell them a house, give them land to work up, no discrimination. Many virtues applied to both civic and religious life. So many of our founders really liked Confucius Analects because they knew Confucius was teaching the same virtues. And if people could learn, oh, this isn't true just because Jesus said it, it's true because it's a human virtue. And of course, our founders knew Aristotle very well, and he knew his virtues. And he knew the Catholic Church was not following Aristotle's virtues. So they knew the hypocrisy. They knew the Church of England was corrupted by power and wealth, and they claimed to be Aristotelian also. So they knew the difference. The main thing is they wanted to create a society where the citizens know the difference, and that's a task. That's why he wrote this book. We have a fundamental right to spontaneously create little societies, to form social groups. No church has a right to destroy another church. They shouldn't even want to. The bishops and hierarchy decide who to tolerate within the church, but they should preach peace and goodwill to everyone. They should never use violence. And, Locke is saying this knowing that they have, they have done that in the past all the time. No one complains of how their neighbors live. No one should complain unless it violates their rights. No one should complain about another's religious beliefs. You're free and equal to believe what you want. The civil magistrate doesn't control souls, cannot force people not to be lazy, cannot force people to get rich, right? A rational person isn't going to be lazy and isn't going to get rich, but they can't be arrested for it. There has to be a lot of social norm, people get praised or criticized if they're lazy or greedy. The church isn't infallible. Salvation exists in your mind. The civil magistrate should tolerate all kinds of rituals. They're the outward forms of worship, circumstances, otherwise indifferent things like bread and wine becoming sacred is no concern for the civil magistrate. It refers to this huge battle between the Lutherans and the Catholics, because the Catholics claim that the priest during Eucharist, he's given this power from Christ to change the wafer into Christ's bodies and the wine into Christ's blood, literally. And Luther says, no, Jesus did it once, and the ministers just repeat it, just remind you of that. It's just symbolic, right? And boy, they fought about that. And, John Locke says, forget all that. That's Europe. Get over it. Here, we don't talk about that. It's indifferent. Let people believe whatever they want in church. If it's lawful in civil life, it should be lawful in church. And if it's not lawful in civil life, it should be illegal in church. The virtues are not identical, but because the main difference is just how you justify. But the laws don't conflict with what any reasonable religion would require. Okay, the Israelites did not force people to convert. So, he's referring back to the Old Testament. And, okay, Jesus didn't force people to convert. The articles of faith are practical doctrines, creeds. Some are practical, some are speculative. People can believe whatever they want in civil society, but they can't act on irrational beliefs and act irrationally, right? The civil life, the civil magistrate is concerned with how you act. If the leaders act in ways that violate someone's conscience, or some citizen acts in ways that violate the private conscience of a civil leaders, civil leaders can't take away your possessions for that. Even if the magistrate believes taking properties for the public good, that's a personal judgment and not based on the rule of law. So they're not acting like the civil leader. If you have the power of a judge, it's because it's been given to you by the legal system. It's not a personal right. The magistrate's opinion should always be the same as the public good. When their conscience doesn't correspond to the public good, they can't use their power to support their conscience. If a sect declares obedience to a different prince and claims not to be subject to the laws, they can't be tolerated, right? So after the Revolutionary War, then Americans needed to abide by American law. And when they were royalists, they were only obedient to the king of England, and they did things that violated American law. They get arrested, it's wrong. Atheists can't be tolerated. But we should tolerate, we should be able to tolerate groups that get labeled seditious based on religion. because they're challenging their religious institutions' beliefs, right? So within a religious tradition, they can criticize each other as undermining their church, but that's not the civil magistrate's business. Again, you're just picturing, what are all these people saying? All the ways that religion and politics got mixed up in people's heads that I don't think we do it. I'm not quite sure. But just governments don't use force unless it's absolutely necessary. When you use force, you create faction. When you tolerate heretics, people who disagree with their religion's doctrine, and schisms within a church, it's no business, right? Government should tolerate that. Anyone who accepts scripture should not be considered a heretic or a schismatic. Jesus did not care about doctrine, right? Or public forms of worship. So, Locke disagreed with his own founders in Britain. He completely disagreed. He completely rebelled against the British founding fathers, right? And the tradition. So, when Americans talk about the founding fathers and they're so great, it's just like, huh? The founding fathers were political revolutionaries. They declared war on their own country's political system. Okay, so he was a deist, which means he disagreed with his own country's official state religion. So he was a kind of dissenter. He questioned the legitimacy of British colonialism, especially the colonizing the USA. His property was taken from him because people assumed he was now living under a different order. He undermined the laws that he was a British. As long as he was British, he should follow British law, and he had to be punished. So Locke, was a revolutionary. And so were our founders. So Americans by nature are not conservative. It's a very odd association between Americans and conservatives, because that is not us. Sorry. Then the next point was the second treatise of government. All right. This is about property and how property is used. Oh, I cannot remember how to do this, but let's see. Okay, so it's a little off-putting. It's not the normal language we use, but you can figure it out. So, though all the earth was given to us in common, everybody has property in his own person. His body, no one has a right to his body except himself, and the labor of his body are properly his. Whatever he removes from the state of nature and leaves what he only removes, he's mixed his labor with, makes it his property. Okay, so he has a right to that. Okay, and let's see. Labor puts a distinction between natural things and what's in common, right? Between property and what's in common. So when you add your labor, it's something more than nature. It becomes a part of culture and is protected by rights. Okay, so the chief matter of property is the earth itself. As much as he tills, he has a right to. It will invalidate his right to say anybody else has an equal entitlement to it. But he cannot appropriate or enclose. He has to have the consent of someone else. And also he can't try to appropriate more than he can use. Okay. Okay. So by appropriating the land, he gives it value, way more value than it otherwise would have. So for example, if he encloses 10 acres, he could create value, which would be 100 times more than what it was worth before he cultivated it. And he says it's probably more like 100 times more, right? It gives way more value and the conveniences of life, right? So, so this will improve human material well-being. Okay. All right. And he does, okay, so in Europe, either they're created a concentration of wealth, and that was the beginning of corruption. But America was like the Garden of Eden, was like things at the beginning, and that's why it's so important that when people appropriate land, they don't take more than they need. So there is enough land for everybody, and nobody gets to have power over somebody else based on wealth. So that was a big deal for Locke, but it's a big deal today, right? We people quote Locke to justify capitalist accumulation of capitalist wealth. And that isn't at all what he had in mind. So here's Locke's general view of rights, because it's a mindset, right? And so it applies to a lot more. So far, I've done it how it applies to economics and politics, and psychology, right? All human beings are by nature blank slates, so free and equal. They're free to order their actions and dispose of their possessions. All human beings are equal in power to each other. Everyone has a right, life, liberty, health, possessions, a right to execute the law of nature and punish people who violates their rights. But they only have a right to punish according to reason when the punishment is proportionate to the crime. God gave human beings the earth for their comfort. Everyone has a right to their body, their physical integrity, a right to what he removes from nature and makes valuable through his labor, a right to the fruits of his labor. The industrious and rational have a right to the land. They have a right to preserve and protect their property. They have a right to punish wrongdoers. However, people don't judge well in their case. They overreact. The state of nature leads to a state of war. Therefore, it's rational to give up your right to punish offenders to the community. Purpose of the community is to protect individual rights. The community protects rights by electing officials who will work to protect their rights, creating a body of laws which protects their rights, applying those laws through a court system in a way that protects their rights, enforcing those laws through an executive system in a way that protects their rights, right? The citizens have to consent to be ruled, right? The rulers have to be elected. If the citizen enjoys the benefits of civil society, if their property is protected, if their life, liberty is protected, they have to consent to the laws. A rational person will agree to give up the right to punish to the community because the state of nature is insecure. The most important function of government is the creation of laws. Everybody's equally subject to the laws, even the rulers. They're made for the good of everyone, not just the rulers. There's no taxation without the consent of the people, or the people they elect can tax. There's no transfer of power elsewhere. When the rulers do not rule for the sake of the ruled. All right, what happens? Well, tyranny is the definition of tyranny is the exercise of power without right. Okay. And you have clearly established what use of that power you have a right to and what use of that power you do not have a right to. So a tyrant exercises power beyond what they have a right to. No one has the right to make his will rule rather than the laws. When the legislators try to take away people's property, they declare a state of war with the people. They have no right to do that, and the people have no obligation to obey. A rational person will not consent to tyranny, to leaders who are abusing their power, because they don't have a right. So if you're rational, you will know that right away. The power reverts to the people. So the people will judge if the rulers are corrupt. The power does not revert to isolated individuals, but to the community as a whole. The best defense against rebellion is a defense against corruption, right? If you're a leader, if you're a political leader and you don't want a rebellion, you better use your power to protect people's rights. In religion, there's no atheists, but it doesn't matter what religion a citizen is, as long as they believe in God and immortality. And it doesn't matter what their argument in their head is for believing in God and immortality. They're different. As long as they come to the same conclusion, they'll behave. What about marriage? From the point of view of a civil magistrate, and this was very progressive, this was radical, this was completely off the wall. Because before that, in the Bible, the marriage is from God, it's based on God, and the wife serves the husband, right? She's subservient, and she does what she's told. There's no such thing as domestic abuse. Women have no rights at that time. Women have no economic rights. They have no political rights. They can't vote, but they have no right to protect themselves from their husbands either, because this marriage was ordained by God. There's no divorce. Okay, so Locke's view is very radical. Says marriage is a contract between two free equal individuals. Extremely radical. And he's saying from the point of view of the law, right? You can tell these people you really shouldn't get divorced because God is going to make you roast. You can do that in church. You can do that in some letter, but you cannot say that as a judge, all right? But what the contract does is it gives access to each other's bodies, right? Sexual intercourse is a deep giving over of one's body to the other. It has to be by consent, not each sexual act, but the marriage itself. Once you consent, there's no such thing as rape within a marriage, okay? But divorce is possible. Amazing, very radical, but only after the children are economically self-sufficient. Because as a rational citizen, you want to provide for your children economically, right? Until they can provide for themselves. You do not, no children out of wedlock, no divorce before the children are on their own and economically prospering. It's rational to want to have children. It's in your self-interest. And husband and wife have equal rights to rule over their children. Also, that was totally radical. The husband works outside the home, so he has a right to the fruit of his labor. The wife works inside the home. So if there is a divorce, the children should want to take care of their mother since she's poured her labor into raising them. But there's no alimony. The woman has no right to some portion of the man's property. So divorce was a disaster economically for women. There'd be a lot of reasons why they would not get divorced. But if a lucky woman would have a kid that would not mind providing for her, that it was legal. The civil magistrate doesn't get involved. It's rational to have children. It's rational to support their children economically. The goal of parenting is to raise children to become free and equal, meaning especially economically self-supporting. So you have to make sure your kids are industrious and rational and all ready to provide for themselves, to work hard and become prosperous. When they grow up, they have to realize that their own security depends on the political system, so they have to consent to abide by the laws. Children can't inherit property unless they agree to join civil society, okay? Now, this inheriting property, again, John Locke, as long as you don't have money, it's okay, because you're not going to get money sticking to money and a shrinking middle class, and you'll lose your free and equal system. So in his mind, it's very important that this is more like a barter economy. What about society? Is the free association of free and equal adults. It's only by choice and consent. You can't be forced to join some group, and you can't be prevented from joining some group. Or put it this way, these groups freely associate, and nobody would want to join a group where they know they're not wanted, right? The free association, the laws can never force someone to be able to join a free association because you can freely make your own rules within your association. Is education a right? Must citizens pay taxes to provide for everyone's education? Well, that was, Locke did not put that into his ideology. It wasn't a big issue. You could be perfectly economically prosperous without an education. The US founding fathers valued education a lot. And you'll be reading an article about that. But it's not in the Declaration of Independence. And the Constitution has that the legislators have a right to provide for the common well-being. I can't remember exactly. I mean, there were 4 things that the lawmakers are responsible for. One of them is the national defense, protecting property, stuff like that. But there's one for human well-being. And that's the one part of the Constitution that's enabled us to have a public education, because education is not life, liberty, health, possessions, right? But it could be argued that you're not going to be able to have possessions unless you get an education. And so then it became possible to mandate public education. Is healthcare a right, right? Not in that minimal government model, right? Do people have a right to housing? No. And the answer, well, how am I going to have a house? Well, just work harder, right? Or how am my kid going to go to college? Well, just work harder and save money. Right to sign business contracts, consent to the conditions. Yeah, but there's no minimum wage, right? And there's no worker protections against safety and hazard protections. Okay, it's a minimal government model, and it's not the model we have now, and I don't think it's the model Americans really want, but there are plenty of people that try to sell you on that. Taxes are theft, and we should not have taxes. Have your own schools, have your own this and that, right? Now, public infrastructure usually works. Highways, bridges, roads. But even in Locke's time, it wasn't much of a big deal. There's no way there were ever any environmental laws on this minimal government. The only way you get environmental laws is if you can prove that somebody's polluting of a stream is making your cattle sick when they drink from the water. Then you can sue if you can show that your material prosperity is threatened by their pouring their sewage in the stream, right? But there's no right. The land itself, there's no right to, protection of the land. Like the land has no right. And you can't use laws to anticipate future pollution. It just has to already have happened, because then you can prove it. By the time we get to the point where you prove that people are dying from this and that, it's all over. Like, that's why we don't have environmental laws. That's why Mr. Trump, Project 2025, wants to remove all environmental laws, because it's violating the free market. It's violating our rights to become prosperous. Cost benefit analysis. Okay, the best way to survive is to be rational in this sense and depend on others to be rational. If people are rational, there's no need for government intervention. Well, what happens when people are irrational? How irrational can people be before the laws become more strict and the law enforcers more likely to try and control or limit people? At what point do the people have a right to disobey? So the purpose of government is to protect against aggression. All nations are in a state of war with each other. So you need a strong military, and then you need strong criminal law. But everything else is, it was a minimal government model. It was an individual model. It's called rugged individualism. And the US is unique in the extent of its minimal government, radical individualism. Europe does not have that kind of ideology. No other country has our ideology, our set of ideas. Okay, the Declaration of Independence. I'm just going to flash this up here for a minute, and you should read it so you know it's stolen from John Locke, okay? Okay. So when it becomes necessary for the people to dissolve political bans, okay, that's what John Locke has given an argument for when it is necessary. And to assume among the powers of the earth a separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them. That is, nature's God is that deism. The laws of nature are born free and equal and have these rights. The respect to the opinions of humankind requires you should declare the causes. You have to justify it, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident. Okay, so that's Descartes' self-evident truth, except that it's not the same truths that are self-evident. It's all people are created equal and they have inalienable rights, life, liberty, and Thomas Jefferson put out Pursuit of Happiness. To secure those rights, governments are instituted, right? They derive their just powers from the consent of the government. of the governed. Whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it's the right of the people to alter or abolish it and institute a new government. So if you just read through this, it's really plagiarized from John Locke. So I do have a more specific example where I just took excerpts from Locke and excerpts from, okay, let me do this for a second. Okay. All right. All right, we met. Okay, so here's the US Declaration and the idea of a maker, all these things. The legislators have to govern by established laws. They have to be designed for no other purpose than good of the people. They can't raise taxes without consent. They can't transfer the power of making laws to anybody else. Tyranny is the exercise of power beyond right. Wherever the law ends, tyranny begins. Okay, when the leaders exceed the power given to them by the people via the law and use force on the subjects, which the law doesn't allow, they're no longer legitimate leaders. When they take and destroy the property of the people, reduce them to slavery. So we give this is the principle, the definition of tyranny. To this and our founders say, people will say that your philosophy is going to lead to constant revolution because people are always complaining about the politicians. And we answer, no, really, people tend to live by habit and they accept a lot of corruption. But if it gets bad enough, a long train of abuses, lies, and tricks tending to the same way. So the scheme is visible to the people. They have a right to rebel. Who shall be the judge of whether the prince has acted contrary to their trust? The people shall be the judge. This is the Declaration of Independence. The power given anyone when he entered can never revert to the individuals, but it remains in the community. The people have a right to act as the supreme legislature and continue the legislation, the protection of their rights in themselves, or to erect a new form, or under the old form, place it in new hands. So you can elect someone, or you can have a revolution. Freedom of speech, right to peaceably assemble, okay, and all the things about soldiers, right to be secure, what dissolves the government. So in the Declaration, there's all these examples of, first of all, the legislative has changed. The tyrant, the person in power, introduces new laws. They have the legislature, they don't assemble it often enough. The electors are altered. They deliver people into the subjection of a foreign power, on and on and on, right? And then when the government's dissolved, the people have a liberty to provide for themselves by erecting another legislature. Revolutions do not happen due to slight mismanagement, but after a long train of abuses has occurred. So that is John Locke, right? So this section is John Locke. So, right, our founders are literally quoting from Locke, okay? And they use that to provide evidence. So they're acting empirically. They're using the scientific method to give data. Okay, so their conclusion is that the leaders have acted as a tyrant. So they have to prove that. And they give all this data, all this set of descriptions about what the king did and his representatives. And so then they conclude that, yeah, we do have a right to rebel, and we're going to rebel. All right, so the way I learned it in school was it was a principled rebellion, right? It was based on principle. Um, all right, so I have another outline, but I think it just goes over the same thing again because I wanted to keep reinforcing because it's a mindset, it's a way of thinking, and especially it's appealing to a certain understanding of human reason. And so really the history, Western intellectual history, is about our understanding of the natural world and our understanding of human reason. So Aristotle had one understanding, and then the paradigm completely shifted during the scientific revolution, the Industrial Revolution. But there were different paradigms during the Enlightenment. And all of them still have a big influence in American culture. And because we have been the world's superpower for 75 years, we have exported our culture, our way of thinking. But at the moment, China is rising. And one reason they're rising is because they have a different way of thinking. And their way of thinking really has the government using science and technology for sustainable, to become an economy that's based on a sustainable culture, right? They're going to make money making green products. So they have a different philosophy, and they're being very successful right now. We're still stuck in our minimal government fossil fuel economy. We're stuck in the past. But at the time we were founded, we were the progressive people. Britain was stuck in the past. The British should have let us go. They shouldn't have had a war. It wasn't worth it. But they definitely didn't want to give up their empire, and they believed in the divine right and kings, and they believed in an official state religion. They believed in a nobility class that inherited. They just wouldn't give it up. But the world was changing. Science and industry, opportunity, all this stuff. And so, that's why we were successful, because we were cutting edge. And now China is cutting edge with a whole different paradigm, and they're successful. So what are we going to do? We're going to be that, I don't know. We're going to be reactionary. We're going to change. What would our founding fathers think today, right? If our founding fathers were racist and sexist, right? Some of them owned stock in slave trade companies. Some of them owned slaves, like Jefferson had a lot of slaves. Washington had slaves. Washington freed his slaves in his will. Jefferson did not, which really blows me away. What about women? Would they give women the right to vote? Would they give them equal rights? Would they really want us to exploit natural resources when it's clear we're destroying the earth? Would they want us to ignore facts? Okay, were our founding fathers progressive? Yes, they weren't reactionary. So, yes, they would want women's rights. They would want racial equality. They would want environmental protection, because all these changes are based on facts. And our founders were absolutely committed to facts. They were also absolutely committed to having a middle class, because they understood through Aristotle, greed and a no middle class is going to lose your democracy. And they knew entrenched class structure was not democratic. So they would be in favor of a tax on the rich, of redistribution of wealth, I think, right? All right, they were from a lot of different traditions. They believed in the union of faith in some sense. I read one place where there was one Baptist and one place where there wasn't even one Baptist, but the political documents show they want to unite reason and faith, right? They also reflect a desire to separate the way of thinking connected to political life and from religion. That not in, they wanted to point out there's a lot in religion that's consistent with civic life, but they're not identical. And if your tradition is tolerant, you're probably okay. Okay. All right. What okay. They accepted the customs they grew up with, some of them. Some of other ones were more progressive. The documents are based on new view of science. They each had their own view, the relation between reason and faith. They wanted to train people to understand political life as concerned with facts. They didn't want politicians to use God. Slavery. Would they want slavery to have ended? I think so, right? But it's up to you, but they're progressive. Would they want women's equality? I think so. Would they allow atheists into civil society? I think so. That they were wrong, they had a prejudice. Would they think Native Americans deserved to be killed and had no knowledge? No. I think at this point, they would realize the Native Americans, we have to incorporate their indigenous knowledge in order to prevent the destruction of life on Earth. What about evolution? Yeah, I think they would accept evolution at this point because it's proved with science. What about gay rights? Yeah, I think they would allow it since it's been proven scientifically that some people are attracted to same-sex attraction. And if you use the Bible to justify discrimination, our founding fathers would say, keep it in your church, don't bring it into the community. What about guns? The Second Amendment did not advocate guns as an individual possession. Rather, they said you could have a citizen militia if the state militia comes after you. Well, that's not, that is not the way it's being interpreted now. Now it's just unbelievable. It's just a private enterprise. It's a personal choice. If I have the money to buy this, it's just a consumer good. They would not. The Second Amendment does not make any kind of gun control illegal. Environmentalism, I think that they would change to once it's established that we're destroying the earth with the way that we're using it, they would have laws that you can't destroy it. You can't. They wanted people who were industrious and rational to pass on their land to their children, grandchildren. They wanted this to be sustainable. Didn't occur to them it wouldn't be. So I'm sure now they would want environmental laws that aim at sustainability. Given the founders all knew that they were cutting edge, would our founders want us to shift to a new paradigm? And I think they would, right? International laws, would they want us to promote international law? I think so. Even though John Locke said nations are at war with each other, I think he would change when he realized there's so many laws we need for environmental protection. There's so much communication between people all over the world. We need laws about trade and about protecting the sea and all this stuff. Would they want us to try and create an economic empire using their ideology? Would they want us to dominate their earth, to dominate the global economy? No, John Locke didn't even want money. Okay. Would they want a president who talks about his religion? No, not at all. Okay. Would they want us to exploit the resources of other countries? They did at the time, but I don't think they would now because they realize these people are human. If they're natural rights, then everybody, truly everybody, is free and equal. Religious toleration. So they were, of course they would want toleration. They would want it even to tolerate atheists at this point. If you take the founders literally, and as conservative Christians, if you just literally take, they would deny citizenship to women, Africans, Buddhists, Hindus, Confucians, Muslims, Celts, pagans, Wiccans, members of any other world religion, secular humanists, moral relativists, people who believe in evolution. Would they want to prevent us from having immigrants? No, because Locke said, as people come and if there's enough land, and there should be enough land if you have a barter system. Would they set up barriers and commit hate crimes against? I do not think so. If we really try to think like the founders, because we're always referring to founders, but if you want to take it literally, how many current US citizens would there be, right? Not very many. And the people who are most adamant are often the people who would be those very few, right? The white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. The trouble is, what if one of your children marries a Latino? Whoops. What are you going to do? Not let their spouse get citizenship or kick them out of the country or what? The facts have changed. So, and the founders are based on facts. The facts have changed. Then I do this thing about the Project for the New American Century. And Roe's strategy to sell the president was to appeal to religion, all these things that were not at all what our founders had in mind. And our founders would be very worried about it because ever since 9/11, we've started to have a political climate that is the opposite of what our founders wanted, and also that they knew was going to undermine our democracy. So I think that that it's important to know, the ideas that drove our country and then how things have changed. And if you just look at the first part of this class about toxic culture and social media, literacy and Burn Book, Zuckerberg, that what's going on in the universities, the centralization of wealth that Glenn Hedges talks about, all these illusions, and then our food system and how it wrecks your health. It's just our founders would be worried, and they'd also be annoyed that their ideas are getting used to justify this because they did not want the kind of crony capitalism, income inequality, never-ending exploitation of natural resources to the point of self-destruction. There's no way that they would want that, and yet they get used to justify it. Minimal government, keep the government out of my life. Socialism is taxing me to have to pay for schools or roads or anything to promote social well-being as opposed to just military and police. I think our founders understood the need for a strong and stable middle class. And they were Aristotelian in their understanding. Well, they liked Confucius, they liked Aristotle's virtues. They didn't like the Catholic Church trying to control those virtues, right? John Locke said, no, love God, love your neighbor. What's your problem? And then they wanted to have virtue clubs. They really wanted, I think, people to govern themselves and take turns ruling and being ruled. But their ideology was about rights because it was modern, it was enlightenment. So the ideology and the justification of the laws, the legal system, was one thing to fit in with the times, but the spirit of the times needed to be the love of wisdom and the Aristotelian Confucian. And I think Buddhist and all these other ones have a pretty common set of virtues. They knew that that was important also in the way people related to each other. But these ideologies get abused, and it's very important that you know that.